All right, looks like we're at the top of the hour. Welcome everyone to our Guava and Osterman research webinar today on next generation archiving. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava, and I'll be hosting you here today. We do have a large number of people on this call, and really excited to be able to bring you this topic, and we're excited that you're interested in this one. We're very pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. He will be the principal presenter here discussing next generation archiving. Just a little background on Michael. He's an industry expert and the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry and has spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging collaboration industries. Before we jump into the presentation, just wanted to make you aware that we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions as we're going through this presentation, feel free to put them through in the Q&A section there or the chat section of the Adobe Connect software. And we'll make sure to address those questions at the end. And just also take note that this webinar is being recorded, so if you want to share this with others, everyone on this call will be getting a link to the webinar recording, so you can go back and review it. Also, everyone on this webinar who registered and who is attending will get a copy of the white paper that accompanies this webinar on next generation archiving. So we'll go ahead and give the time to Michael Osterman, and he will go through the presentation. Michael, go ahead and take it away.
Well, Q, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody here on the call with us today. We do look forward to hearing your questions, and so please ask them, in the interface throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So just a little bit about Osterman Research, so you get a level set on our perspective here. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on the way that people communicate or collaborate in the workplace. So we focus, obviously, on things like archiving, but also security, authentication, encryption, content management, and so forth. Basically, any technology that allows people to communicate or collaborate at work. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be going through a bit of that here today. The company is about 15 years old, and we're based near Seattle, Washington. So let's get right into it. First and foremost, what is archiving not? Very often when we do surveys, we'll ask organizations, we'll ask IT decision makers and so forth, do you have an archiving system in place? And the vast majority of people say, yes, we have an archiving system. But some of those people are actually referring to their backups, whether on tape or disk. They're referring to content that they've stored on file servers or in users' mailboxes, basically information that they can go to satisfy some sort of a request for older information. They may be, if they do get a request from senior management to look for information, from former employees or for old presentations or old word processing documents, what have you, they will look on individual desktops, they'll look in PST files, they'll look on laptops, mobile devices. Basically, they'll scour the organization to look for this information. But that's not really archiving. What we're talking about in the context of true archiving is the systematic retention of business records, whether that's in an email, whether it's a file on a file server somewhere, maybe it's on a mobile device, maybe it's in your CRM system, can be basically anywhere, including even social media posts. And we're talking about a system that will systematically archive all of the business content out of whatever sources of information you have, and then store it in an archive where it cannot be tampered with in the future. That has good search tools on the back end, so that basically somebody that's going through an e-discovery exercise or doing some sort of an early case assessment, or they have to respond to a regulatory compliance request, can go into that archive and extract the information that they need, and they can be assured that that's a true and authentic copy of the information they're looking for. And there are a couple of types of archives. There's a journal archive, or what's commonly known as a compliance archive, that's a truly immutable, true record of the business records that an organization needs to keep for long periods. And then there are mailbox archives, which are essentially an archive of users' mailbox contents. Both are very useful in the context of of long-term archiving, both useful in the context of supporting e-discovery, litigation support, regulatory compliance, and so forth. But there is a significant distinction between backups and archiving, and that has been lost on a lot of decision makers. Many do believe that their backup is their archive, and that definitely is not the case. So today, archiving is primarily about playing defense. For example, the vast majority of organizations that archive information are doing so to protect themselves for some future event. So, for example, if an organization has a likelihood of being sued at some point, or if they have regulatory compliance requirements, for example, they're in the financial services industry or healthcare or life sciences, government. There are a number of industries that have specific regulatory requirements to preserve data. They will preserve their business records that they think they'll need in the future. Again, for litigation support or e-discovery or regulatory compliance. Maybe it's just retention of corporate history. They want to maintain records so that they can, prove a point in the future or go back to their records and say, okay, this is how we did this process. This is how we need to do it in the future. There can also be reasons for archiving that are in support of employee productivity through some sort of an end-user self-service system. So if an employee needs to access his or her older word processing documents or presentations or financial projections, whatever they happen to be, he or she can go into their own archive and extract data that's maybe several years old without having to have IT get involved. Also, storage management is another reason many organizations will archive. That's becoming less of a reason, as we'll see here in just a moment, but it's still a driver for a lot of organizations. By moving content from live servers into archival storage, you can basically free up storage on those live servers, and you can have a much better experience when you need to restore a server. For example, if a hard disk crashes on a server, there's simply a lot less content there that needs to be restored. So both backups and restoration occur much more quickly. So the basic premise of what we're calling archiving 1.0 is simply keeping stuff just in case you need it at some point in the future. And a lot of organizations will keep data maybe for 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. Some regulations require the retention of data for indefinite periods. But the bottom line here is that you're keeping stuff just in case you need it to protect yourself at some point in the future. And so what we've seen in past surveys is that the drivers for electronic archiving are changing over time. As you can see here, this came from our research that we've done. We've asked typically mid-sized and large organizations, what are your primary drivers for archiving? And as you can see here, both litigation and regulatory compliance are key drivers for archiving, and they're getting more important over time. That defensive nature of archiving is becoming more important because organizations are more likely to be sued. There are a greater number of regulations that organizations need to satisfy and so forth. At the same time, the need to improve storage management through some sort of an archiving system is becoming less important. And that's largely because mailboxes are getting bigger and servers can store more data, but also organizations are moving to the cloud. And so storage management from an on-premises perspective is simply getting less important because organizations just don't need to worry about storage management. If you've outsourced your email, for example, to a cloud provider, they worry about it. You as a customer no longer have to. We are, however, entering the world of what we're calling archiving 2.0. And content archiving really is entering that next major phase, despite the fact that most organizations really aren't there yet. We're calling it archiving 2.0 or next generation archiving, and it's fundamentally focused on taking a more proactive role, a more offensive role in the context of archiving. So it's not just about preserving content to defend yourself, it's also about preserving content so that you can get some value out of what you've stored. Now, it's important to note that the offensive or proactive role for archiving is not in any way displacing the defensive role. There will continue to be a need for defensive archiving 1.0, and the need for that is going to become more important in the future. We have more need to preserve information for litigation support, for e-discovery, for regulatory compliance, and so forth, and that's going to become even more important as we store more and more different kinds of data. Today, archiving 1.0 is dominated by email retention. In the future, we're going to see much more focus on file retention, social media post retention, storage of information in CRM systems. Basically, any electronic information that your organization generates is going to need to be stored in some sort of an archiving system so that you can preserve those records to defend yourself against bad things that can happen. So bottom line is that archiving 1.0 is going to become more important, but archiving 2.0 is as well. So what do organizations archive today? Well, as I noted, the vast majority of organizations archive their corporate email. 89% in a recent survey that we conducted reported to us that they retain corporate email in an archiving system if they are implementing archiving. User files, also another very important thing that needs to be retained. Content from SharePoint, content from company-managed file sync and share tools, Dropbox-like equivalents that are managed by IT, corporate instant messaging content, voicemails, content from company-owned mobile devices, and so forth. And we anticipate that all of these bars are going to be moving to the right over time. And again, this is primarily today in support of archiving 1.0. Organizations, when they do get faced with an e-discovery requirement, when they do get faced with a regulatory audit, will most often go back to email as the first thing as a source of corporate business records. But all of these things are becoming more important over time. We're seeing more emphasis on content on mobile devices, as the news has demonstrated in the current political race. We're going to see more content required from file sync and share tools, from various types of collaboration tools like SharePoint. Social media is becoming cited more, for example, in e-discovery cases. And so all of these things are going to be required in the context of archiving 1.0 so that organizations can defend themselves. But at the same time, you're going to need all of this information to support archiving 2.0 as well. So fundamentally, when we talk about an archive, we're talking about stored business records, regardless of the source, whether it's email or social media or files, what have you. But fundamentally, what is in an archive? Well, it's really a record of what all of your information workers are doing during working hours and what they do when they're away from office working on company business, for example, when they're traveling or checking email from home, what have you. It's not just the record, but it's also information about how organizations and employees generate and store those records. It's a record of every communication that occurs between employees, between your prospects, your customers, all of your business partners, whatever companies are in your supply chain, whatever contractors you've hired, and so forth. It's also a record of information about how employees are dealing with the sensitive content that your organization possesses, such as sending or storing content via corporate mail, whether it's via their personal email system or a corporate mail system, whether or not it's in a file sync or share tool, maybe it's sent via text messaging, what have you. An archive also contains a record of how employees respond to customers and prospects, as well as those communications to which employees did not respond. So, for example, if you're getting sales inquiries through email, you can find out by examining the archive how long it took for an employee to respond to that email and provide the information that the customer was requesting. Or you can find out if the inquiry just went unanswered and the customer went away and never came back to ask another question. An archive also contains a record of every business relationship that is maintained by employees. We tend to think of LinkedIn as this source of business information and networking, and you're finding out what's happening with your peers and with people in your supply chain and so forth. But your email system and your archive of files and other information also contains that information. An archive also contains a timeline of employees' responses to time-sensitive communications. You can see how long it took an employee to respond to a particular communication and to see if they did so in a way that satisfied the time requests by the sender. An archive also contains a record of every appointment that's set by employees, where they were at various times if you're storing geolocation data, and a lot of other relevant types of information about how employees spend their day and where they might be spending it. And finally, an archive also contains the communications that employees have with competitors. That goes on in just about every organization. An archive contains that information, and it's not usually available in any other source but an archive. So what can you learn from all of the information that you've stored in an archive? Well, first and foremost, you'd find out if employees are complying or not complying with the various corporate policies you've established about protecting sensitive information or complying with the email acceptable use policies. For example, if you have a policy that sensitive information needs to be encrypted before it's sent, you can find out from the archive whether or not that information was actually encrypted before it was sent, or if you're sending sensitive information like protected health information, personal financial information, and so forth, through the email stream in clear text. You can also find out if that information was sent some other way, maybe through text messaging or an employee's personal email account. You can get some overall corporate sentiment based on employees and management's communications. There was an interesting finding from a law firm a couple of years ago, and they found that the number one determinant of employee fraud is how employees were treated at work. So if a manager was abusing his or her employees, there was a much higher likelihood, based on their research, of that employee committing fraud, maybe stealing sensitive data or sending information to competitors and so forth. By examining the content in an archive, you can determine that corporate sentiment, and you can find the employees that are being abused by their managers. An archive will also reveal how salespeople interact with prospects and customers, how quickly they respond to customer inquiries, and also their tone in those responses. Are they conciliatory? Are they aggressive? Are they fully satisfying the inquiry, or are they just sort of brushing it off and providing as little information as possible? Also, another important attribute of an archive is that you can determine the real organization chart in your company. Very often, there's an official organization chart and then a real one, where you can find what some people call the mayors in your organization, the go-to people that employees will go to get their questions answered. It may not be their boss. It may be somebody else in the company that has more knowledge and maybe really should be the boss, but today is not. Finally, you can determine the social relationships that exist within your company, and you can that help fellow employees find the expertise and influencers that they need to do their work more effectively. So, for example, going back to that concept of mayors, you may find certain individuals in the company that others are communicating with to get their expertise on maybe how to solve a customer inquiry, how to solve a problem in the company, how to deal with management, whatever the case may be. By looking carefully at the archive and having the right analytics tools available, you can determine what those social relationships are, and that can go a long way toward helping you and your organization really understand what's going on in your company, as opposed to looking at some sort of an official organization chart that may not reveal that information. Now, it's important to note, as I mentioned earlier, that email is but one source of information. It's an important one, and it's the place that most organizations start when they begin their archiving journey, and it's the one that we recommend. If you're going to begin archiving, begin with email, because it's the primary source of communications and collaboration in your organization, and it's also the primary way that people send files. If you look at a typical corporate email system, about 98% of the bits that flow through it today are actually files that are in the form of attachments, because 1 in 4 emails contains some sort of an attachment. So, certainly start with email, but it's not by any means the only source of information. There's also SharePoint, various social media tools, whether those are personally managed or managed by the company. There's various kinds of files on file servers all over your company, on individual desktops, laptops, mobile devices, what have you. There's CRM data, there's content stored in file sync and share tools. There are mobile applications that contain their own sets of data independent of any other source that may be in the company. There are ERP systems, there's information on calendars that can be helpful, there are blog posts, and really a wide variety of other information. And all of this content is a source of archivable information, and you should look at all of these sources and then some to determine what content in your organization should be archived, because you may have specific regulatory requirements to archive some of this information. There may be, some legal reasons to do so. And just, there's a lot of history and a lot of information that can be stored in all of these sources of information that your organization can use effectively. As just one example, let's say you've got a new marketing manager on board, and she needs to get up to speed on what has been explained to past clients about promises that the company has made, products that they're going to deliver, things that they won't do, whatever the case may be. All of these sources of information are valuable in helping her to come up to speed on what has been explained to clients. And you need an organized way of analyzing and presenting this information. It's not just about going through all of the raw information. You need an organized way of presenting this information and accessing it and searching it so that you can get useful information out of it. So there are just a whole bunch of use cases. We'll go through just a few here. For example, an archiving 2.0 system, a system that will archive information and then provide good analytics tools so that you can analyze what's really in that content, can dramatically help sales management. If you look at a typical CRM system like Salesforce, it contains really only a fraction of all of the sales interactions that occur in your organization. Now, that's not to say that CRM is not a great tool. It's fantastic. You absolutely need to have it as an organization, but you also need to look at other ways that salespeople and others interact with your company. For example, if you have a customer inquiry come in about a new product feature, a problem that a customer is having, and so forth, that information from email may or may not make it into the CRM system. So you need to look at an email archive to understand what has been told to clients, what they've been promised, what they've been told about future plans, and so forth. If you use an archive effectively, decision makers can learn quite a bit about the sales process that you really wouldn't otherwise know. They can learn things that just will never appear in the CRM system because salespeople and others are not necessarily as fastidious as they need to be about putting every piece of relevant information into CRM. Another example, another use case here is identifying potential data breaches. If you have a next-generation archiving platform coupled with a very good DLP solution, it can help you to identify anomalous information flows. For example, you can take a look for very large amounts of information that are being sent that are quite unusual. Maybe one employee is transmitting or receiving lots of information that they otherwise shouldn't have access to, or that represents an anomaly from their normal workflow and so forth. You can find accounts that are accessing unusual data sources. Maybe they're accessing databases that they otherwise never did before. So they can reveal, maybe an employee planning to leave the company, maybe some sort of an insider threat. You can also find, when employees are communicating. Are employees communicating, from Starbucks at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon? If they're trying to access confidential databases, that's sort of unusual. And an archive with good analytics tools on the back end can reveal these kinds of anomalous behavior and help you to identify potential data breaches. Also, you can find potential sources of employee fraud. As I mentioned earlier, employees that are abused by their managers are more likely to commit fraud. If you find the abusing managers, it'll give you a starting point for looking for that potential fraud and potentially cutting it off so that you don't experience a problem with a data breach or an employee sending information to a competitor. You can understand and develop the social relationships within your company. For example, if you have a good archiving 2.0 platform, you can dramatically assist employees in helping to find expertise within the company. For example, if a salesperson receives a customer inquiry, and he or she has no idea how to answer it, a good archiving platform can help them to understand who in the organization might be able to help. Maybe a former employee of that customer, maybe somebody who's had a relationship with them before. You can really develop those social relationships and do a lot toward expanding the capabilities to respond to customer inquiries, to help employees become more knowledgeable about others in the organization, and so forth. It can really help you with policy and legal compliance. You can understand if employees are complying or not complying with all of your corporate policies, with their legal obligations, with their regulatory obligations, and so forth. And finally, a good Archiving 2.0 platform can help you to understand employee sentiment. That's very important. And we're not talking about snooping on employee behavior, but we're talking about understanding the sentiment that employees have. Are they happy with management? Are they listening to management? If there's a change in the company, how do employees respond to it? Are there ways that management needs to communicate more effectively or more completely with employees? A good Archiving 2.0 platform will help an organization to do that. What we've also found is that the market is shifting to Archiving 2.0. We did a survey in 2016, and we asked, what value do you as an IT decision maker see in an Archiving 2.0 platform? And what we found is that today, more than a quarter see little, if any, value in having Archiving 2.0. By 2018, though, we anticipate that's going to drop to a much smaller figure, and those that see a great deal of value in Archiving 2.0 are going to increase quite dramatically. Now, it's important to note that there are very few companies today that have what we consider to be a true Archiving 2.0 platform. They don't have a robust archive that captures a wide range of information, and they don't have the good analytics tools on the back end to be able to analyze that information and really extract intelligence from it. As organizations, though, get these systems implemented, as they're educated about the value of Archiving 2.0, we anticipate that we're going to see the numbers in the yellow bars shift dramatically to the right. There's a tremendous amount of value from a next-generation archiving platform that organizations will see. And once you've been exposed to it, it just sort of dawns on you, okay, I can do this, but I can also do these other 5 things that are going to provide value to my sales process, to my employee management process, whatever the case may be. The problem, though, is that most of today's archiving solutions really were never designed to support Archiving 2.0. They were designed to support the defensive nature, the Archiving 1.0 schema. And so it's important to note that the vast majority of organizations that have an archiving platform really are not effectively geared up to do Archiving 2.0. They can do pieces of it, they can do small elements of it, but they can't do a full-on Archiving 2.0 implementation with the current archiving platform they have. Part of the problem is that data tends to be stored in silos outside of corporate control. There's a lot of data in personal Dropbox accounts, in mobile apps, in personal email accounts, basically in a variety of BYO types of solutions that employees have implemented, and that limits the ability of the organization to look into that content and extract intelligence from it. And when you have data in silos, these silos really are not easily connected. Today they tend to exist in fairly autonomous silos that are very difficult to integrate, and so it's very difficult to get information out of them. And that increases the risk for an organization, simply because you don't have access to all of the information that you need to make the proper decisions about what is going on in your organization. Effectively, IT and senior management are blind to a lot of the information and a lot of the occurrences that are happening in a company simply because they don't have access to all of the relevant information they need. So in terms of next steps, first and foremost, you need to understand the importance of the traditional role of archiving. We see a lot of organizations that today haven't even implemented Archiving 1.0. They're deleting information after 30 days. They're leaving it up to individual, They're leaving it up to individual employees to decide what to archive and what not. And these are sometimes very large companies. I spoke with a company recently that that basically is a household name, excuse me, and that doesn't archive past 30 days. And so they're not even geared up for archiving 1.0, let alone next generation archiving. That's an important issue for any organization. Archive your business records because you will need them for defensive purposes. Then you need to implement the right data management approach. You need to understand that you need to integrate information from silos. You need to give IT control over the information that employees are generating, and that includes in all of their personally generated sources, their various file sync and share apps, cloud apps, what have you. It's a good idea to implement a corporate alternative to all of those tools that provide the same ease of use, but that give IT control over the information that employees are generating. You then need to understand what next generation archiving will be able to do for your organization. Go through some use cases, go with either consultants or industry analysts or vendors. Really try to understand how you could use next generation archiving to enhance your organization, to gain some competitive advantage, to really understand what's going on in your company. And then finally, once you've done all of that, implement the right archiving solution that's going to enable your move to archiving 2.0. I apologize for the typo there. There are some solutions out there that you need to consider, and you need to implement the right one so that you can make that full-on move to archiving 2.0 because it will provide enormous value to your company. Okay, and that concludes my part of the presentation. Q, I'm going to hand things back to you now.
Great, thanks, Michael. Wonderful information. Great information about that next generation archiving and the evolution of where it's going. Yeah, thanks for the information. I know that we all benefited from this. I just wanted to give a quick overview of Retain. As this is a Guava webinar, I just wanted to let everyone know that as Michael's talked about an archiving solution, Retain is an archiving 2.0 solution that supports a lot of the things that we've been talking about. It supports multi-platform email, social media, and mobile communication, and it's archived into one central archive to avoid those data silos and to be able to easily extract that information. So yeah, if you want more information about Retain and how it could work for you and how it could benefit you and how this archiving 2.0 solution could work, we encourage you to go to guava.com to learn more. And of course, as I stated, this webinar is recorded, so feel free to review this. And of course, I think there's another slide here with Michael's contact information. So we do have some time now for questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to put those through. I did see one that came through really quickly for you, Michael. Is what about like a monitoring ability? So like monitoring stuff as it comes into an archive. Is that something that's needed or something that you advise to get?
Yeah, I think monitoring is a very useful tool. It helps organizations to set up alerts, for example. You can set up an alert when an employee, for example, has sent information to a competitive organization. Maybe when content is being downloaded in some very unusual way. It really is a very useful tool. Where Archiving 2.0 comes in is really sort of doing the forensics, if you will, on communications and file generation and file storage and so forth. So I think both are really complementary. One is for real-time or near real-time, whereas the other, Archiving 2.0, is much more forensic in nature and really helps you understand sort of trends in your organization more than a monitoring solution could.
Great. Let's see. There's another one here about social media. Can we archive something as personal as like social media, like personal social media? What's the thoughts behind that?
That's it. Yeah, that's a more gray area. I think certainly if the personal social media is being used on a corporate network, for example, somebody's at work and they're using the corporate network to send information, I think you're on good legal ground, at least in the United States, in being able to archive that personal information. If you're in other countries where privacy requirements are much more strict, that's a different issue. If you're in Germany, for example, that can be a much different issue than it is in the States. But certainly, at least in many countries, I think you're on fairly solid legal ground in storing that information. And I should say I'm not a lawyer and I can't offer legal advice, but generally I think you're in good shape by doing that.
Wonderful. And then another question that's similar is about mobile devices. So if somebody's bringing their own personal device, is that something we can and should be archiving? Like what they're like, say, text or whatever they're using on their phone.
Yeah, I think so. If they're accessing a corporate resource, for example, like corporate mail or maybe SharePoint, and they're accessing that on a personally owned device, I think you do need to archive that content. And there are a number of good mobile solutions that will essentially allow an organization to manage the corporate side of that device, if you will, and wipe it clean, for example, if the device is lost without touching the personal information. But I think mobile archiving is becoming more important because more and more users are spending time on mobile devices. We did an end user survey recently, and I'd be happy to send anybody a copy of our full results if you'd like. But essentially, we found that users spend a lot of time on mobile devices, and that content doesn't necessarily make its way into a corporate archive. So for example, if somebody receives a request from a customer on their mobile device and they respond by sending a file or a text message or some other communication, that content, if it's a personally owned device, may never hit a corporate archive or a corporate email server, and it's information that's relevant to the company because it's a business record, but they have no way to access it in the normal way of doing things. So I think mobile archiving is a very important thing that organizations should be looking at, if not actually doing.
Great. Let's see. And this one's about regulations. Do you have maybe just a couple examples of how regulations would affect what an organization archives?
Yes. For example, in the financial services space, FINRA, the SEC and FINRA dictate that you have to store communications with customers. And so you have obligations to preserve all of those communications with customers. You have obligations to archive them, to number them sequentially, and so forth. That's financial services is probably the most heavily regulated. But also in the energy space, there are requirements to archive information because you have to make sure that you've got a wall, an ethical wall between the marketing side and the generation side, so that you're not giving unfair advantage to your own people in terms of producing information for one side versus the other. Healthcare has specific regulations about retaining data for certain lengths of time. The life sciences industry, the FDA, for example, has rules about what pharmaceutical companies have to do in terms of retaining information. And bottom line is that all industries have some level of regulation. If you have any employees, for example, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission says that you have to preserve employee records for a minimum of 1 year. Now, that doesn't mean you have to store them electronically. You could print things out and store them in a filing cabinet, but more and more information is being generated electronically, so it makes sense to have an electronic archive. But there are not regulated and unregulated industries, but heavily and lightly regulated, if you want to call it that.
Okay, great. That looks like all the questions that we have right now. Just to finish up, I wanted to just make one more mention. If anyone is interested in getting a demo, a personalized demo of Retain, we can offer that just once again by visiting guava.com. We could give you a quick overview of how it can handle all the defensive aspects of archiving, and also how it can give you great insights into how to handle, like we were talking about, the archiving 2.0 offensive or proactive aspects as well. So once again, just want to let everyone know that if you're interested, please reach out to us and we can schedule that demo for you. And then finally, just to finish up, I'd like to thank everyone for being here and for your interest in this topic, and especially like to thank Michael Osterman for his presentation and for the information. And look for that email with the link to the recording, and hope to see you guys on the next one. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you.